Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. We're going to review a new device right here. This one is called the abxylute. It has a couple unique features to it. Number one, it has a pretty unique design, but then also it has a unique naming convention. Here's the back right here. As you can see, it's spelled abxylute. I checked with the company and they said it is supposed to be pronounced as absolute, so that's what we're going to go with here today. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this one is that it is a streaming focused handheld. So it's meant to be played with things like NVIDIA GeForce Now or Steam Link, or Xbox Game Pass or Remote Play, things like that. The question is really going to come down to whether or not you want a streaming focused device. Now, you may have heard of another one that's very similar to that, and that is this one here, the Logitech Cloud. I've done several videos talking about this one here, and I really do love it. I think it has great ergonomics and a great screen as well. The thing I don't like about it is that it's too expensive. The MSRP on this is $350, although you can find it for $300 here and there as well. By contrast, the abxylute is starting at $199 during its initial campaign, and it'll go up to $250 when it goes to full retail. So it's going to be a full $100 cheaper than the Logitech Cloud. The big question is going to be, with that $100 savings, are you still getting a great experience? And that's what we'll touch on here today. But to give you a quick spoiler, I will say this device works really well when it comes to streaming. And then secondly, if you want to play retro games on a large screen, this is going to be one of the best bets you can get for that lower price point. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right in. Alright, let's get started with some of these specs here. Number one, let's talk about the SoC. So this is going to be running a MT8365 CPU. This is a quad-core chip that is clocked for 2.0 GHz. And it's also going to feature 4 GB of RAM. Now, one of the crown features of this device is its 7-inch LCD panel. This is going to give you a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with an aspect ratio of 16 by 9. In terms of battery, we're looking at 5200 mAh. That's pretty big, and it's going to give us around 8 hours of battery life altogether. Now, one place that abxylute did not cut corners is the connectivity. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense considering that this is a streaming device. This is going to feature a dual band 5 GHz Wi-Fi signal that uses the multi-user, multiple in, multiple out technology. This is the same type of technology that you see in those weird looking routers that have a bunch of legs on them. And without getting too far into the weeds here, it essentially means that you'll have a much more secure connection. In fact, this may be the first handheld that I've seen that has this technology here. In terms of other features, we have Hall sensors for our analog sticks and analog triggers. And finally, when it comes to internal storage, mine had 64 gigs, but I think I read there's going to be a 32 gig model as well. Now let's take a look at the device itself. It is relatively sleek looking, and it'll come in either black or white colors. I did find that the plastic on the black one was a little bit smudgy for my tastes. Now, given this is a streaming handheld, I think that controls are going to be very important, so let's do a deep dive on these. We're going to start with the analog sticks first. And these are Nintendo Switch style analogs that are very reminiscent of other Hall sensor sticks like on the Anbernic RG353 and the upcoming RG405M. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it was the exact same supplier. And that's actually a good thing. I really like the caps that are on the edges here. They have a nice kind of grippy feel to them, and the sticks themselves feel very smooth to use. I also like the fact that these sticks protrude a lot from the shell. In fact, it's a lot like a Nintendo Switch as opposed to like an Anbernic device where they're more inset. Now, when it comes to calibration, I'm not a big fan here. Number one, they're using a circle style input, as you can see, with a gamepad tester. Essentially what this means is that when you try to push a diagonal, even though it's going to give you a nice round circle, it's not going to go to 100% signal. Instead, the corners here at these rounded edges are only going to give you about 60% of the actual signal. What this means is if the game is configured this way, instead of actually running at 100%, your character will walk instead. And that could be quite annoying depending on what game you're playing. Additionally, I found that these sticks preferred the cardinal points. As you can see here, you get up, down, left, and right much more than the inside corners. But given the fact that these are magnetic Hall sensors, that means you're not really going to have any dead zone either. That could be a good and a bad thing depending on the game you're playing, but I did find that I didn't need to press the stick all the way in order to register at 100%. Ideally, we would have a 1-to-1 ratio when pushing on the stick, and so if we push it halfway, it would go 50%. Instead, it feels like I don't have to push it all the way to get to the edge of the signal. And the result here is going to mean that these sticks may feel overly sensitive while in game. Now, bear in mind this is a test unit here, so it's not the final product, and so some of these things may change. For example, if we go onto the abxylute website, you can actually see in some of their promo images that they're using just regular Nintendo Switch Joy-Con caps right here. And so things may change depending on the final product, so I recommend checking out the Kickstarter page just to take a look. Now, by comparison, the Logitech Cloud has larger sticks that are more like a smaller Xbox stick altogether. I really like the feel of these, and even though they also had similar issues with the cardinal points as well as the circular input, Logitech actually fixed this in the software later on, so maybe abxylute will do the same thing as well. As they stand right now, I would say these sticks are serviceable, but they are not perfect. Also on the left side, we have a select button up here, and now let's talk about the D-pad. Now this is quite a chunky D-pad, as you can see right here. It's very flat and large. However, I did find that the D-pad itself was just pressed a little bit too far into the device. For example, when pressing down on the cardinal points, it felt like it was bottoming out and pressing up against the actual shell. Generally, with a rubber membrane D-pad like this, you want to have a little bit extra height here. As it stands right now, the amount of pivot and travel right here is just a little bit less than I would like. And that will make it a little bit hard to do some of the more granular and sensitive inputs on a D-pad, and I'll show that off here in a minute. Now, this was a very similar setup on the Logitech G Cloud. As you can see right here, it also had fairly low travel and pivot, but the difference here is that the D-pad on the Logitech device was flared a little bit more on the edges. And as a result, the input didn't actually bottom out against the shell. So at least cosmetically, just by pressing on them right here, I would prefer the Logitech device over the abxylute. And it's very obvious here that there are some similar design choices overall between button placement and size and everything else. Now, in practical use, again with the gamepad tester right here, I found that it is almost impossible to do a good diagonal. As you can see here, when I'm rolling against the diagonals, you can see I either get one of the side inputs or the bottom, but not both at the same time. In fact, I have to press down very hard on both edges just to get a single diagonal input. It feels very unnatural to press it down this hard. Now, when doing the upper diagonals, like up and left and up and right, it's a little bit easier, but still more difficult than I would like. And so the fact that it is so hard to press on the diagonals here actually leaves me pretty worried. Let's actually test it with some games. For example, here with Darkstalkers, which is a Capcom fighting game, it's very hard to do the Hadouken move overall. And to do the Dragon Punch or Shoryuken, it's basically impossible. I have to mash it down so hard that it no longer becomes a pleasant gaming experience. And so overall, I would say it feels very unnatural to use this D-pad to play fighting games. In the end, it's just too hard to press down on the diagonals when you're actually playing. And I can only imagine how bad it would get over time if you were to be pressing down on that rubber membrane and it starts to soften. It's going to get even harder. As another example here, let's do the crouch test in Contra. What I do right here is press down and then try to go left and right. The sign of a good D-pad is that it'll actually stay put and won't go left and right, and that's actually happening here. But I would say it's happening to the extreme because it's almost impossible to shoot down at a diagonal in this game. And so again, this is another indication to me that the diagonals are just too difficult to use on this device. Again, this is a test unit, so maybe they're going to tweak this D-pad later on in the future, but as it stands right now, I feel like this is going to make a lot of retro games just basically unplayable. If you think about any sort of platformer or fighting game or any other kind of run-and-gun game like Contra, I feel like the lack of a good diagonal in those games are really going to leave you high and dry. In fact, I would say the diagonals on this are harder than they are in the Logitech G Cloud, which didn't have great diagonals in the first place. Also on the front here, we have a back button and then one of the two stereo speakers that are forward-facing. That's really nice. Now let's move over to the right side, starting with the face buttons. Now these actually feel pretty good. They also have a rubber membrane connection, so I have a classic kind of retro push to them. And I would say the overall travel here is actually relatively good. It's a little bit small, but all the same, I still like it. It actually takes a very light press to push down on the button, which means you're going to be able to press it very quickly, which is going to be nice. I also like the fact that these buttons are a little bit wider than some other retro handhelds, and so because of that, they do feel very good. And much like with the D-pad, it's very similar to the Logitech G Cloud. The only major difference here is that the Logitech Cloud had a little bit of a lip around each of the face buttons, and I actually like this feeling. It felt like the shell itself was rising up to greet you as you press down on the button. So between the two, I would prefer the Cloud setup here, but on the abxylute, it's not bad either. On the bottom right, we have a home button and then our other stereo speaker. And I like having front-facing speakers. I think that's better than like the bottom-firing ones on the Logitech Cloud. Let's take a look up top. We'll start with the shoulder buttons. These feel pretty good. They're kind of long and skinny, but all the same, they have plenty of space for me to rest my finger on, and they're very easy to press down on, so no complaints here. Next, we'll talk about the triggers. Now, these are analog Hall sensors, and man, they are actually very, very good. They kind of have a paddle sort of setup setup to them, but they have just the right amount of travel to them, and they're a very good size as well. They're really in a Goldilocks position, not too big and not too small. There are a lot of other retro handhelds that use a paddle setup like this, and often they get it wrong, like they make it too much travel or some other issue. And I would say the abxylute ones right here are actually some of the best that I've ever tried on a handheld like this. So that's great, because if you're going to be streaming games, often you're probably going to rely on the trigger inputs, especially if you're going to be playing something more modern. And in that regard, these are going to be great triggers. To give you a comparison, here are the ones from the Logitech G Cloud, and as you can see, they are much smaller and have more of a pivot than paddle kind of setup. And I would say this is the other input that's a little bit lacking on the Logitech Cloud. And so if I had to choose between these two triggers, I would pick the abxylute ones every single day. They've got a little bit greater range of motion and a larger size that just feels very good. On top of that, I feel like they're calibrated perfectly. For example, when I press on the trigger halfway, it does register at about 50%. And of course, when I want to get to 100%, it's right there as well. And so I'm a huge fan of these triggers. They are both accurate and they feel very good. Continuing up top, we have our volume up and down buttons, and then a microphone and the power button. Now each of these are relatively flush against the case. That's nice because you won't accidentally press down on them, but I also found that when actually wanting to press down on them, they're kind of hard to find. Moving over to the bottom, we have a micro SD card slot on the right here, and the software is currently limited to FAT32 file format only. That means your file sizes are going to be limited to 4 gigabytes, but honestly, this device is not capable of playing any other game sizes like PS2 that are going to be larger than 4 gigs anyway. Also on the bottom, we have a headphone jack, a USB-C port made for charging and not for video out, and then finally another microphone input. Looking on the back here, we have just a simple logo, and you can kind of get a feel for the overall design right here. And honestly, it looks very sleek and sharp. The problem here is that this sharp design actually feels relatively sharp in the hands as well. For example, there's a pretty sharp angle right here with the grips, and it's also a similar kind of feeling here at the edge of the device as well. What this means is when you're actually placing this in the hands, there's two kind of pinch points for you. The first is along the edge, like it feels a little bit too sharp against your hand. I wish it was more rounded. And then there's the grip itself, where there's a specific cutoff point right there where it goes into the grip and then not. And while the design itself looks sleek, I don't really like the feel of this in my hands. It's just too angular. To me, it almost feels like this handheld was designed in a drawing room, and the person who designed it didn't actually ever hold it in their hands. It reminds me a lot of those concept cars that you see sometimes in the news, and you realize that this is not a very practical design. It's kind of neat looking in a showroom, but when you actually want to use it, it doesn't make sense. And I feel like the design here with the abxylute's ergonomics is just about the same. As a comparison, look at how chunky and thick the grips are on the Logitech Cloud. Not only are they nice and big, but they're also well-rounded too. If you look at the bottom here, it has a more teardrop shape, which is just going to mold directly into your hand as you grip it. And this is one of the reasons why I find the Logitech Cloud to be one of the most comfortable handheld devices available today. Not only does it fit into the center of your palm very easily, but there's plenty of space for your fingers on the grips as well. And because it's nice and rounded, it feels very good on the back too. By contrast, the abxylute lacks that kind of teardrop shape, and it also is kind of sharp against my palm, and the back of the grip has such a sharp angle to it that it doesn't feel comfortable either. My only guess here is that the abxylute team wanted to make the device as thin as possible just to make it look very nice. But I think in a real-world context, I would rather have something that's thicker and more comfortable than something that just looks nice overall on a spec sheet. So in the end, not a big fan of the ergonomics. Now let's move over to software. I'm going to boot up both of these devices at the same time and see how long it takes to actually get to the menu page. First thing you're going to notice is that the software itself is also very similar between these two. Now I've heard that the Logitech Cloud is a result of different collaborations with different Chinese companies over the past couple of years. And I've also heard that the abxylute team kind of picked up the mantle of some of those older designs and made their device. Now, I don't know any of these background details myself. After all, I don't create devices. But all the same, it is kind of interesting to see how similar these are, both from a hardware and software perspective. Now, in terms of boot time, it takes a little bit less than 25 seconds for the Logitech Cloud, and it's going to take about 42 seconds for the abxylute. Now, given these are both Android devices, you probably don't need to power them down very often. You can actually just leave them in sleep mode and then pick them up when you're ready to play. But let's go ahead and continue with the software experience. And again, you can see right here with the user interface, it is basically identical between the two. Yes, one has a different skin than the other, but the overall experience looks to be very similar here. And this setup right here within the software is referred to as handheld mode. And like with the Logitech device, this is probably what it's going to be on by default. Now, if we go into the handheld settings, you can also see that the settings menu is almost identical. But one of the most important things you can do here is go into the device information section and then select switch to tablet mode. On both of these devices, that will basically transform it into a regular Android tablet. This is going to be important because in handheld mode, you can't do any sort of swipe motions with your finger. Now that we have it set up like any other Android tablet, I'm going to do my favorite thing with these gaming handhelds, which is to install the Daigisho front end. This is going to give your device a more emulation-focused front end that's just going to look really nice to navigate. Now let's jump into the Ada64 app and take a look at some of these specs here just to verify. And as you can see under the system, we are running that MT8365. And additionally, we have 4 gigs of RAM and I have an internal storage space of about 64 gigs. On the CPU side, we can see this is a quad-core chip and it currently is clocked at 2 gigahertz right now. Another interesting thing about this device is when it's powered on, it does have little LED lights here behind the face buttons. And these are a very subtle light blue and I actually really like it. If we turn the lights off right here, you can see they're not really all that bright, especially compared to the brightness of the screen. And so I'm a fan of this in the fact that it is a nice kind of light up experience, and it's probably not going to be too distracting in the dark. Speaking of dark, let's talk about the screen variation between the Absolute and the Logitech Cloud. At the very lowest setting, you can see that the Absolute is much dimmer than the Logitech. In fact, I've always felt like the Logitech is a little bit too bright in dark environments. And really, it's a night and day difference between the two right here. I would say the Absolute is going to be just fine to be able to play in the dark, whereas the Logitech, maybe not so much. Now, going over to full brightness, it's very similar between the two, but I would say the Logitech Cloud is maybe 10-15% brighter overall. And so what this means is that the Logitech might be better to use in very bright environments, like using outdoors. Now, I took the Absolute with me on a cruise a couple weeks back, so I did play it outdoors for quite some time. And even though the footage makes it look like it's basically blank right here, it was actually pretty easy to see with the naked eye. And so in an outside environment, I would say the Logitech is still serviceable. And either way, you're probably not going to play it at the max brightness anyway. 50% seems to be just about right. Now at 50%, in comparing the two right here, you can see that the Absolute is quite dimmer. But I also think that it has a lot more detail and is just nicer on the eyes as well. So overall, I'm a big fan of the screen right here. It has a good dynamic range to it, nice saturation as well. And at 50%, it does look very nice. All right, let's move over to some testing. We're going to start with some streaming just because this is what the device is made for. We're going to start with Steam Link, and this one had a very solid connection, as you can see right here. And I should mention, there's a concrete wall between me testing right here and the router. And even with that setup, the Steam Link interface between my PC and this device was rock solid. Next, let's go ahead and do a test of those front-firing speakers. Overall, I think it sounds very good. The sound quality is nice and distinct, and I think these speakers are well positioned in the fact that my hands don't actually cover them up while playing. And so overall, I think the audio quality is very good and the positioning is well placed. Now when it comes to actually streaming gameplay, this was a very good experience as well. When streaming PC games via Steam Link, the experience was actually very, very good. It actually got to that point where I'm always looking for with streaming, when it doesn't feel like you're streaming the signal itself, but that you're actually playing it on the device. And honestly, with a lot of streaming over Wi-Fi, that feeling is kind of hard to come by. But I would say here with the Absolute, yes, it is definitely working very well. Now, in addition to doing local streaming like with PS5 and Xbox and my PC, I also tested out some cloud streaming too. And this also had similarly impressive results. If you're new to the channel, you may not know, but I live in Hawaii, and we have some of the worst cloud streaming services available in the US. It has to do with those thousands of miles of ocean between us and most cloud-based servers. But as you can see here, when playing Xbox cloud streaming, I wasn't getting any artifacts either. In fact, this was a very solid connection as well. Honestly, this was just about as good as doing remote play within my house, and that's usually very rare when it comes to cloud streaming. There could have been a couple things going on right here. Maybe I just had really good mojo when I was testing, but all the same, at least from a connection perspective, this was a very, very good experience. So if you're looking for something with a very strong connection when it comes to cloud streaming or remote play, I think this is going to be a very good fit for any of the services that are out there, be it Xbox or Nvidia GeForce. They all worked very well. Now, the test unit that I was sent from Abxylute did not have the Google Play Store on it, and so because of that, I couldn't play a lot of games because I didn't have Google Play services. But I was able to sideload some free games like Vampire Survivors, and I just wanted to verify here that yes, Android games do work and the controls are registered correctly. Now, I wouldn't play something like Genshin Impact on this processor, but all the same, if you want to play something very lightweight, this is going to work too. And that 7-inch display is going to look really impressive depending on the game you play. Now, because you're watching this video, you're a genius, which means that you probably know that the name of this channel is Retro Game Core, and so let's actually do some testing with retro games. As I mentioned, I set everything up here with the Daijisho front end, and so I can navigate through my games and launch them from here. And we'll start with the easy systems and move our way up. Starting with Game Boy, as you can see right here, it does look pretty good. Now, I made some configuration changes in the back end, which is why you're going to see this green coloring right here, and I also applied an LCD grid shader, so that's going to make it look much like an older Game Boy. And on the 7-inch display right here, the screen looks nice and big. And it'll be the exact same story with Game Boy Color, which looks very good here too. You are going to get some black bars on the left and right, but because the screen is so big, it really didn't bother me at all. Now, other systems like Game Boy Advance are a little bit wider, and these ones look really impressive. In fact, Game Boy Advance was probably one of the best things that I played as far as retro emulation on this device in particular. Not only were the colors nice and vibrant, but the games played at full speed, and I also applied that LCD grid shader, and so everything looked really authentic too. And because we're using a 1080p resolution screen, that means the scaling is going to look nice and balanced too. This means I can scale it all the way up to the edges of the screen and it's still going to look pretty balanced. Now, the 8-bit and 16-bit systems also played really well, so the home consoles like Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis and even Super Nintendo. No matter what game I tried, all of these games ran at full speed, absolutely no problem here. And like with the other systems, the colors were nice and vibrant. It was a really good experience. The only real detractor from this overall experience was the D-pad and the diagonals. Certain games, like for example Madden Football, or even a platformer, all of those where it kind of takes advantage of a diagonal, it just didn't feel very good. So if you do want to play this with retro game emulation, just kind of think about those diagonals and whether or not you're okay with playing those games with an analog stick instead of the D-pad. Because the truth is, when playing with an analog stick, for example with arcade games, it was a really good experience. I was a little bit worried about the diagonals on the analog sticks and that they wouldn't give a 100% signal, and so it would feel a little bit weird. But I found it to be a pretty good experience for those games that relied on joystick-style controls. I also found the D-pad to be perfectly fine when it came to racing games. Usually you're just going to press left and right with these anyway, and so because of that, no problems here. Now moving up to the other systems, for example with PlayStation 1, I was running this in RetroArch with a 2x resolution, and it worked really well too. So in terms of performance, we were able to emulate all the way up to PlayStation 1 with absolutely no problem. However, after that is when all the problems start to appear. For example, with Sega Saturn, it was very far from getting full speed. I tried both the Yabusan standalone emulator as well as the RetroArch core, and they both performed very poorly. In fact, I couldn't find a single Saturn game that played at full speed, so I would say that Sega Saturn is really not playable on here at all. Now for Nintendo 64, I was able to get some games to run at full speed, but I had to make some tweaks. Number one, I'm using the Mupen standalone emulator, and then I had to downgrade the resolution down to 240p. Now honestly, with Nintendo 64, 240p resolution doesn't look too terrible. It mostly just kind of looks like you're playing on an older TV. And so if you don't mind that smudginess, then yeah, you can play a lot of Nintendo 64 games on this device. But of course, it's not going to be perfect. For example, if you try to play some of those harder to emulate games like Cruisin' USA, it's definitely not going to play at full speed. It actually gets pretty close, which is somewhat impressive, but overall, I would say that maybe hit and miss when it comes to Nintendo 64. Moving over to Sega Dreamcast, I would say that the performance here was even worse than Nintendo 64. It's more along the lines of Sega Saturn. Even though the Redream emulator has an auto frame skip, which works pretty well, in this particular case I was getting about 45-50 frames per second overall. And so unfortunately I didn't find a single Sega Dreamcast game that I would consider to be fully playable. Now I'm a big glutton for punishment, so we're going to go all the way. So let's move up to the next system, which is going to be PlayStation Portable. For this system I found that performance was all over the place. For certain games I could play them at a 2x resolution and they played just fine. So for games like Virtua Tennis World Tour and even Ridge Racer, I actually got mostly full speed at a 2x resolution right here. And honestly, these games looked really good on this 7-inch display. However, other games just struggled overall. For example, Tekken 6 and even Outrun 2006 didn't even play at full speed at a 1x resolution. Now personally, I wouldn't even want to play PSP at a 1x resolution on a 7-inch display. It just looks really fuzzy and kind of muddy. And so overall, I would say this is not a PSP capable device, but you might get surprised here and there. Now for the other systems beyond PSP, just forget about it. These are not going to play at full speed at all. For example, even the easiest to play games, something like Crash Nitro Kart on the GameCube, only plays at about half speed. Same thing with Maximo, which is one of the easiest PS2 games to play. I had to play it with maximum underclocking on. And even then, it did play pretty close to 60 frames per second, but just had a kind of a weird, kind of sluggish feel to it overall. So I would say that PS2 and GameCube are just not going to be enjoyable on this device at all, no matter what game you try. And then finally, I also tried the Skyline emulator, which is a Nintendo Switch emulator. And I only tried one game here, which is Sonic Mania, which is generally the easiest game to play on this platform. And it's a little bit hard to see up here on the top left, but it's not even getting 60 frames per second with this one game. To me, this is a clear indication that Nintendo Switch emulation still has a ways to go on this chipset as well. Okay, with all the testing out of the way, let's actually start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the abxylute handheld. We'll start with what I like, and number one is going to be that nice big screen that we have right here. Not only is the 7-inch size very impressive, but the color and saturation is very good. And I think it has a good dynamic range when it comes to playing in the dark at a lower brightness, and then also playing outside at a high brightness too. I also think this device really excels when it comes to Wi-Fi streaming. Either remote play or cloud streaming both worked very well for me. And I found that the analog triggers on this device are superb. They are way above average. In fact, I would love to see these specific analog triggers in other large devices like the Logitech Cloud. I also appreciated the audio quality right here. Number one, we have front-facing speakers, but the quality itself is nice and crisp. And I think the speakers are fairly well positioned too. I also found that the device did very well with retro gaming, but with an asterisk and caveat. And that is that diagonals with the D-pad are not great. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself and talking about things that I don't like about the device. So let's move over to this section next. Number one here, I didn't like the sharp angles on the design of the device overall. Like I mentioned before, it felt like a design team really hadn't held a lot of handhelds before they made this really kind of cool shape. But in terms of ergonomics, when you actually hold it into your hands, you can find that it's going to be a little bit sharper on the edges, and the grips themselves have a weird angle to them that isn't very comfortable either. Like I mentioned just a minute ago, the D-pad diagonals also leave a lot to be desired. It may be that abxylute is going to fix this before the final release build, but at least for my test device, I really didn't like that experience. For me, it's pretty frustrating when a specific system can be emulated well, but the controls actually hold it back. I think this device is really good when it comes to 16-bit gameplay and things like Game Boy Advance as well. But I don't like the fact that I have to pick and choose what games are going to work the best just based on the fact that the D-pad doesn't work very well. And then finally, I was a little bit disappointed in the emulation power on this device. Obviously, this is not made for emulation, it's actually a streaming handheld overall. But all the same, I had some pretty high hopes of being able to at least emulate like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. In the end, the big question here is whether or not I find the abxylute to be worth its starting price of $199. And I think that really is going to come down to you and your specific use case. If you are only looking for something to stream maybe from your PC or remote play, or maybe do some Xbox cloud streaming, then yes, I think this is a pretty good fit. However, bear in mind here that if you want to play D-pad centric games, it might not be as great as you would expect. Also bear in mind that the ergonomics on this device kind of prevent me from wanting to play it for extended periods. I think it's just fine for maybe 20-30 minutes, but I found that anytime I played for like an hour or maybe longer, the ergonomics just kind of got to me. And I think if you're going to be paying $200 for a handheld, you shouldn't have compromises like that. To give you some perspective about the overall experience, I had the abxylute for about 3 weeks of testing before making this video. And usually while testing, I spend a lot of time with the device just to really get acquainted with it and just kind of enjoy the experience and then share that with others. And during that 3-week period, I found that I was actually playing the Logitech G Cloud more than the abxylute. And I wasn't working on a video or anything with Logitech Cloud, I just really like playing it. And I think that says a lot. I spent more time playing on a device I wasn't working on than the one that I was actually doing a thorough analysis of. In the end, I want abxylute to be a good device. I think that for $199, a device with a large screen and nice controls is absolutely worth it. But unfortunately, I found that there were just too many compromises with the current iteration of the abxylute to actually make it something I would recommend. Instead, we're back in that same old spot where I keep saying the Logitech Cloud is a great device, but just too expensive. And I do hope that sometime in the future the Cloud does get reduced in price to be a better match. However, as it stands for me right now, I don't find the abxylute to be a good enough replacement for the Logitech Cloud. Yes, it's a $100 difference between the two, but the corners they had to cut to get down to that lower price point to me just aren't worth it. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Is $199 the correct price for this handheld, or do you think there needs to be other changes before it's a go? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!